Welcome to the program. I'm Jeff Schechtman. As a writer, journalist, and commentator, Frank Deford was a national treasure. He helped us to truly understand so much of what really made America great. I had a chance to speak with Deford back in 2002 upon the publication of his book, American Summer. We talked about America in the 50s, polio, American optimism, and the state of baseball at the time. In listening back to the conversation, it seems that only baseball has improved. Here's my conversation from August of 2002 with Frank Deford. And he's here to talk about his newest novel, An American Summer, just published by Source Books. Frank, thanks so much for being with us.
It's my distinct pleasure, Jeff.
Delight to have you here. First of all, one of the things about American Summer is the period of time that it is set in, a period of time that there is a tendency, I think, too much of a tendency sometimes to look back at with great fondness, a period of time that people seem to feel very comfortable with. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I think there's a contradiction there, because if you were alive in that period in the early 1950s, and American Summer particularly is the summer of 54, there was really a frightening scourge. We were scared to death of polio.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to imagine what it was like. I can't, for example, really imagine what the Depression was like. You can tell me all about it, but I still don't quite get it. And I think people who weren't alive after the war, when polio epidemics became very regular every summer, I don't think they could understand how frightening it was. There were times when draft inductions were stopped for fear of the polio virus spreading. Pools were closed, movie theaters. Hospitals refused to take polio patients. And throughout, there was just this tremendous fright that parents had, and it was particularly true because children, infantile paralysis. Children were attacked as much as anything. That does not mean for a moment that adults were scot-free. But it was a frightening time. And the amazing thing is, Jeff, that in the spring of 55, Jonas Salk's vaccine was approved, and polio just dropped off the map. It was gone. It just disappeared in a short period of time, and in disappearing so fast, it dropped out of our memories. You read about the 1950s, and there's almost no reference to it whatsoever. It's quite amazing.
And to what degree did the fear that polio engendered, and one of the interesting things about the fear is that it crossed all lines of class and everything else at the time, to what extent did it shape the sort of politics and the attitudes and culture of the time?
Well, I think in what you're saying is true, that we'd come through a war, a terrible war, the war that we finally won, and there was a sort of a sense of taking a deep breath, and it was a time of great prosperity. The veterans came back. They went to the school through the GI Bill. They then settled down and began to raise families. Tremendous move to the suburbs. It was a very sunny time. But I think polio, in a way, sent the message that you're never safe. You can't beat everything, and no matter how good things are, peace and prosperity, no, you're never home free.
Right.
And I think it affected us that way. And also the fact, as you mentioned, that it did cut across all lines. If anything, and this is a great irony, polio seemed to come to the suburbs, the upper classes more. And
Right.
there's a reason for that. That in an odd way, our hygiene had improved so much in the United States that we had, in effect, lost some of our vulnerability. We were too clean. And so then when the virus struck, we couldn't handle it as well. I know that sounds, and I'm not doctor enough to understand quite why, but I think you can see that's one of the reasons that it hit the United States so hard, was ironically because of our prosperity. Our president, Franklin Roosevelt, the earlier president, had suffered from polio and was a paraplegic.
One of the other things that grows out of this, and you touched on it a moment ago, is the degree to which, once the vaccine was discovered in April of 55, the degree to which it was wiped out so quickly.
Gone.
And that it really fed into the kind of post-war American optimism that whatever the problem, that whatever the crisis, that we could solve it, that whether it was science or technology or American ingenuity and American enterprise could solve any problem. And it took that post-war optimism, and because it was such a big issue, just drug it into bold relief.
I touch on that in the novel. The sense that we were America, and that's sort of the subtext of the novel.
Right.
We can do anything. The father in the novel who had fought in the war and comes home and inculcates that feeling in his young son, who's probably the central figure in the book. We're Americans. We can do anything, and we can even conquer disease if you throw enough technology at it, if you throw enough money at it, and the government gets behind it, and the people get behind it. Nowadays, we're used to all kinds of charities and appeals. Polio, the National Foundation, the March of Dimes, really started that. The sense that we as Americans, just give us a dime, give us $1. We can do something too. And so there was this sense when polio was conquered that we had participated in it as Americans. It wasn't just some guy in a laboratory somewhere. Not only that, Dr. Salk, and he was criticized for this by some of his colleagues, was himself not afraid to court a little publicity. And he was a person. You could look at this one guy, and obviously he needed a lot of help from a lot of other doctors. But this American had done this wonderful thing with our support. No question. It was very much a part of America and Americana.
And your central character, Christy, is very much a part of that Americana. And talk about how it affects him and how it ultimately will affect, his generation that comes of age from this period.
Christy is 14 years old when the book takes place, and he's like any 14-year-old, and that's about what I was at that time. Very, very familiar with polio. Nobody got away from it. And as I said in the book, I'm sure I was thinking of myself at this time. I mean, there's elements of Christy which are me. It's going to get somebody else. I'm safe. It's this terrible thing, and every time I see somebody embraces, or every time I hear about somebody who died of polio, it sets me back a little, but it's not going to touch me, because I think all children think that they're invulnerable in that way. He encounters then, in the book, very early on, a young woman in an iron lung, Catherine, who's 23 years old, who had been extraordinarily beautiful and graceful and a wonderful athlete and vivacious and everything you could think of. And she's struck down by polio, and here she is wasting away. And it's their friendship, really a love affair, if you will. It's a love story in an odd way, which is at the center of the book. And he learns so much from her, from this cripple. And children particularly look away from anybody who's different, let alone somebody who's basically just a head sticking out of an iron lung. And she, by contrast, finds purpose in her life this summer in dealing with this young boy and shepherding him along and teaching him sort of the ways of the world, and also coaching him in a swimming race that he's going to participate in. And so the two draw so much from each other, and as I say, it really is a love story.
I want to come back to something you just touched on, this idea that young people, and I wonder if this has always been true, or if it comes out of some of the things that we have been talking about, that when they see people with illness, with disease, that it is somehow something to turn away from or to shy away from. It's as if somehow everything is contagious. It goes against that kind of optimism that we were talking about before.
Might frighten you a little, too. There, but for the grace of God go I. I had a daughter who died of cystic fibrosis, and I wrote a book about her, Alex. And I think, obviously, Alex was 8 years old when she died, and my polio victim, Catherine, is 23. So there's a lot of Alex that I couldn't use. But I think the experience of living with someone who did have a terrible disease affected me a great deal, and I saw the way that some people would deal with Alex. No, she wasn't in an iron lung, but particularly near the end of her life, it was very, very clear that there was something wrong with her. And she'd cough, and people would, look at us like, get this child out of here. And new children to the block, not really meaning to be mean, but would kind of want to look at her as, some sort of a freak. And And yes, her friends, the people that knew her and loved her, surrounded her and stayed with her till the end. But I think new children encountering somebody like that tend to be put off on the one hand. They mock in many ways as a sort of a defense mechanism. I think it's all very natural. I don't think we should blame children for it. Hope they don't, but not be surprised.
Is there something uniquely American about that?
I don't think so, except in the sense that we're healthier than most people. And we certainly were in 1954 when we were the only healthy nation in the world. I mean, everybody else was recovering from a war one way or another. I mean, the statistics are incredibly amount of wealth that we had that time and the amount of power. So, yes, I think that there's some sense of it. I think if you're walking down a street somewhere in some poor African nation, for example, you're not going to be put off as much by handicapped people because you see them all the time. It was unusual to see somebody who was sick in America at that time.
When you look back at that time, and as we started out, people look at it fondly, there were certainly a lot of things going on at that time beyond polio that were worthy of serious consideration, and perhaps segregation being the most pronounced. It was the year of the Supreme Court's ruling in Brown versus the Board of Education. Things that we remember fondly from that period that were a lot more difficult in addition to polio than we like to believe.
I think we all sort of block out the bad stuff, don't we? Particularly as time goes on. We filter in the good things and leave out the bad. Yes, one of the subtext in the book is about discrimination. And I'm not giving anything away to say. I particularly chose the discrimination is against an Italian American. And the reason I picked that as opposed to, say, an African American is that there really isn't much discrimination, if really at all, against Italian Americans today. But then there was. We were much more prejudiced. Casually prejudiced, as a matter of fact. The terms that we used, which would frighten us, which were casual and polite conversation. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you an interesting thing that the editor made me take out a certain amount of dialogue. It was perfectly accurate to use these terms that we did then in our casual conversation. He said, "Yeah, I know you're accurate, Frank, but that's off-putting to call people by these names. We did it then. And we didn't really mean anything by it. We were just unthinking as opposed to cruel. But I had to take him out because he thought it would be too shocking. And things have changed that much. And, of course, another thing which has changed is the mores of the time, particularly the sexual mores, which is something else that I dealt with. This was before women had the kind of freedom and acceptance, full acceptance, that they do now. I mean, again, I don't think I'm giving anything to say, but the father in the story has set money aside for Christy's education, but he has not set money aside for his daughter's education. The theory being, which was very common then, well, look, she'll get married. That's her job. Right. He says that to his son at one point. That's her job to get married.
Right.
And he's not, again, this is not an unusual man, a cruel man. That was just the tenor of the times.
Well, so the whole idea of this intimate story between a 23-year-old woman and a 14-year-old boy would be told very differently in the context of 2002 versus 1954.
No question. Yeah, I mean, things have changed that much. I still think that the relationship between a 23-year-old woman, sick or healthy or whatever, and a 14-year-old boy, that's, you don't see much of that.
Right.
So it would be an unusual relationship in the 14th century. It would have been an unusual relationship.
Right.
But at that moment in time, I think it was even more unlikely, for this young boy to strike up this friendship with this wonderfully sick, wonderful woman who was also sick, but she taught him, and they found each other. And there's a gimmick in the story, or
right.
In that he comes from another town to Baltimore, where
right.
it takes place, where I grew up, and otherwise he would have had friends and never would have developed this friendship. It's sort of like out of desperation in a way that they find each other and then find this wonderful bond that they share. As sort of she helps him grow as he encounters some problems that summer in his family and around him, and she teaches him.
Well, one of the things certainly that was simpler in those times, and I would be remiss if I let you get away without a little bit of discussion. One of the things that was certainly simpler in those days was baseball. It has gotten far more complicated. I know you have some strong views on this issue, and I would love to have you share them with us.
Yeah, it's interesting that summer, '54, as I said, grew up in Baltimore, so I put the novel there. Had to put it somewhere. Might as well use my own background. That was the first summer that Baltimore had Major League Baseball. The St. Louis Browns had just moved there. So I remember it for those reasons as well. And I remember very distinctly that if the game started at 8 o'clock, you could hop on the streetcar at 7:30 and go on down there and walk in and buy a pretty good ticket for, I guess, $2.50 or something.
Right.
And nowadays, you practically have to take out a loan in March if you want to see a game in August with your family, right?
Assuming there isn't going to be a strike.
And assuming that, that's right, that there is going to be a game. The idea that baseball players would have struck in August, I think we could have believed that polio would be conquered a whole lot more than that. And as far as this American summer of 2002 is concerned, I still feel, and maybe it's wishful thinking, that somehow they're going to come to their senses, and they won't strike. And but that's certainly no assurance, because every time since 1972 that there have been any negotiations, it's ended up with a work stoppage of some kind. And the players feel almost magic. They feel like those invulnerable kids of 1954. We can't lose. Right is on our side, and it was once upon a time. Now it's just a matter of money.
Is right on their side
not
at this
anymore.
point?
No, I don't think so. No, not anymore at all. I mean, I was just astounded when they finally agreed, the players, to some kind of drug testing.
Right.
And the policy which they presented was just amazing. It was virtually no testing whatsoever. We're going to test for a while, and then if 5% of the players come up with it, can you imagine 5% of Olympic athletes? That would have been an epidemic more than polio.
Right.
And then if that happens, well, then we'll agree to test a little more stringently, but there was no talk of penalties. I mean, that's sort of the way they feel. And I think this is inherited from a time when they did have right on their side, when they were, sort of indentured servants. And I just hope they sort of understand that they can do better by themselves in the long run by agreeing to a policy which gives everybody a better chance. You see, and that they haven't got that anymore. And I think,
and certainly the owners, I mean, are now portrayed in very much of the time as really the evil villains in this whole piece.
I mean, the very word owner. We don't use the word owner except in sports, do we? No. I mean, landlord. We don't even say landlord anymore.
Right.
But owner, and the owners are more sympathetic than they've ever been, though, because I think people understand that. People understand that basketball owners and football owners have a whole lot better deal, and that the fans have a better deal in those sports. You're not far from Sacramento. Sacramento, if it had a franchise in baseball, wouldn't have a prayer. But it can be one of the premier basketball franchises. And Oakland can be a contender in football. Now, it's done very well in baseball, but of course its best player just walked away last year, Giambi. And that's the situation that's unique to baseball, and why fans are saying, well, why can't it be like other sports where I have a chance? I think that's a very reasonable request. Nobody's asking to take money out of their food, out of their pocket.
The other thing that's at play, and I think that you were quoted as saying this, that in terms of the owners, given what it costs to own a baseball team these days, the greater fool theory, the idea that there's always somebody going to come along to buy it, is not a sure thing anymore.
No, it's not a sure thing at all. As a matter of fact, there aren't any buyers out there. I mean, there aren't any buyers. I don't mean there's 3 or 4. As far as I know, there's nobody with the money who wants to buy a baseball franchise now. If you've got that kind of money, why would you get into a situation where every 3 or 4 years you have a strike.
Mm-hmm.
Why would you buy into that? If you've got that money now, you say, well, I'll see if I can't buy a football franchise. I see if I can't buy a basketball franchise. It's interesting, just in sheer dollars. The Boston Red Sox were the last franchise to sell. And no, that's one of the great franchises in American sport. I mean, it owns New England. I think the price was $540 million. But get this. Part of that was for a cable network, for 80% of a very good cable network. Part of it was for some wonderful real estate downtown called Fenway Park. So really the team came in at about $300 million. The Houston Texans, a football franchise, expansion, $700 million. And all you got was a piece of paper. You didn't get a stadium, just a piece of paper said, now you're in the league, welcome.
Right.
And I think that gives you an idea that the finances have shifted tremendously in just the last decade or so since cable television came in and changed the rules of the baseball game.
Certainly 1954 was a much simpler time, and it's interesting to look that human emotion doesn't change that much in terms of some of the fundamental elements of this story in American Summer. But when you add lots of money into the equation, a lot changes.
Yes. I mean, money always affects us in every way. You know, in any institution, it doesn't make any difference what it is.
Indeed.
It's at the bottom. And I think I also show that yes, we're still human and human nature doesn't change, but some things do. I talk a lot about honor in the book. I don't think we hear that much about honor anymore. It was a much more valued quality in those days. It's a book about honor a lot. The subject comes up again and again and again, and I don't think we hear that so much anymore. So, yeah, human nature remains the same, but the emphasis that we put on it, no question, varies over time.
Frank Deford, his new novel is An American Summer. It is just published by Source Books. Frank, I thank you so much for being with us today.
I enjoyed speaking to you. You're welcome, Jeff.
I appreciate it.